Hi, I'm Yara Igihom. Welcome to Soulfest. This is our exclusive chat with the creators of White Riot. We're joined by director Rubika Shah and contributors to the film, pillars of rock against racism, Mykaell and Pervez Bilgrami. Thank you so much for being with us. Rubika, can you tell us a little bit about how you kind of found your way into this story?
I'd seen the concert of The Clash at Victoria Park, and it struck a chord with me, not just because it was a great performance, but also because I delved in a bit deeper and found out that it was something called Rock Against Racism. And that really piqued my interest because, you know, I think back to the 70s or stories that I hear of the 70s, and I don't really hear that many positive stories about race relations in the UK. So I started digging deeper and deeper, and I found out that there was a small group of people that literally worked in the print shop, you know, artists, photographers, creatives, who got together and they decided that they wanted to stand up against racism in the UK. You know, for it to then become something huge like the Victoria Park Carnival, I just thought this is a story that has to be told.
For Mykaell and Pervez, help me understand a little bit about the backdrop to actually getting involved with Rock Against Racism. Can you help me understand a little bit of the scene at that time?
We're looking at late 70s, maybe 78. It's a period in which British reggae has finally got a foothold. And by that, I mean a few bands have got a major deal. Roots reggae with a punk audience. That was the youth that were reacting against, rioting against state policy, deprivation, and racism. It was a period where I think both black and white youth was struggling with the concept of identity. It's different in the black community than it was in the white community, but these, for the large working class community who were suffering the same challenges from the government, we came together through music, and that music was punk and reggae. And it was in the very early stages of that where the Rock Against Racism movement kicks in. Most of the gigs we were doing, our audience was punk, but we also had a fascist movement who loved the music that would turn up as well. That is the challenge of identity at this period, the complexity of that period.
When this was all happening, I was 4 and 5, so, you know, forgive me for not showing up to the gigs. Do you know what I mean?
You're forgiven.
But it's like you hear like punky reggae party and all of this thing, and you know about these kind of links. But I think what was really striking for me about the film was the way in which it made it come alive a bit. And I think I was particularly struck because I didn't really understand much about your band, Pervez. And I'd really love to kind of know how you even began to go on that journey to being in a band.
Okay, yeah, it's a pretty plain story, really. I think the run-up to Carnival, the preceding 10 years was a pretty dark period in this country. You've seen Enoch Powell make his speech, the growth of the National Front, and we basically grew up with that. And so we grew up with new words coming into vocabulary like packy bashing. So to a point, we put up with it because we were pretty meek and mild sort of people. We weren't like the black guys that I knew who could really take care of themselves. We just couldn't. Even if it was a group of 10 of us, we'd run if there was a fight. You'd leave for work, a woman would throw a bottle at you. You'd go to work with very, very educated people who would call you our tinted friend. You'd come home and find that your mother had been spat on. So, you know, that's a pretty typical day. So, you know, Mike was talking about identity. We had no identity. We were sort of always in the shadows as Asians. So we'd come to the point where it got too much when people were being killed, basically. And we just said, we just can't take this anymore. So some of us started fighting back. And one of the main ways of fighting back was to protest against the National Front. So we went to picket them. In the 1979 election, we went to picket as many National Front meetings as we could. We went throughout the country. And as far as RA is concerned, we grew up in a way with RA. We were ordinary punters. So, for example, Mykaell sitting there, I saw him from far away. He was on the stage. with his Ku Klux Klan outfit. You're looking at, am I really seeing what I'm seeing? We saw The Clash, Tom Robinson. And then we decided that we'd get a bit more involved in it. So but we started our own RA gigs. We progressed to being on the central committee of RA, and we fought it from that angle because we basically had enough.
I'd love to talk to Rubika about the way in which you visualize this story, because it's striking, and I think that parallel with the kind of almost like a superhero origin story, because there's like, on one hand there's a kind of Rock Against Racism Begins vibe going on, and then on the other hand there's a kind of into the Rock Against Racism Spider-Verse type of a thing happening as well, because of the visualization using the zine. I'd really love you to talk to me more about that.
One of the first things actually that people pulled out when we went to interview them, or that they told us about rather, was the punk fanzine. And, you know, being a fan of fanzine culture from that era, I was surprised that I hadn't seen this fanzine called Temporary Hoarding. It was huge. It was like 2 A3 sized pages, and it reported the news that you didn't really hear about. You know, it married like politics and graphics and music and culture and all the things that young people are into. So I worked with an animator actually on a short film called White Riot London. And that was a really great opportunity to practice out like how we would reinterpret this kind of visual material. So when it got to White Riot and actually doing the animation for that, we knew that what we wanted to do, but we didn't actually realize how long it was going to take. You know, these little montages are only, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, but there's so many of them, and they're peppered out, throughout the whole film. And our animator, Levan, a fantastic guy, did a lot of it single-handedly. He just worked really hard on it. And I think the results are there because it's, I feel like all those animated bits could be its own little film.
Absolutely. It's really beautiful work. And I think the phrase that kept coming to me when I was watching this film was like, lest we forget. It kind of feels like there are real parallels in the story that's being related in this film and some of the things that we see going on today. And I just wonder how much that played into your process as you're creating the film and your interviews as you participate in the film.
So I work really closely with Ed Gibbs, who's the co-creator of the project, writer and producer. And together, I guess like everybody in Britain and around the world, actually, we saw Trump being elected, we saw Brexit, we saw all these things happen over the last 5 years, and they all contributed to, our desire to make the film. And what we've seen recently actually happen with Black Lives Matter and conversations about race, again, in the zeitgeist, in the media, and this film now being a part of that, I think is really great because, like you say, we shouldn't forget the lessons of the past. And this is something that had been forgotten for such a long time and hadn't really been acknowledged. There's so many stories of positive stories of race relations in the 70s. And actually, this is just one of them. And I hope that people do start looking at our history, our contemporary British history with a new lens and thinking about, the experiences of different people, not just white British people.
Am I looking at this through a kind of rose-tinted glasses or whatever and looking back nostalgically? To me, the vibe that I got from the film was that the Asian community, the Black community, there seems to be more unity. I don't know, am I projecting? Is that something that was true of the time? Is that something that's kind of been lost along the way somewhere?
It really depended on where you were located. I'm from Birmingham, and Birmingham had a big Asian community, and that community was immersed in reggae. If all the reggae records that were sold in Asian shops on cassettes made it into the charts, the profile of reggae would have been much bigger. Let's put it that way. In terms of concerts, again, it was a complicated period where you didn't have mixed bands. What Rock Against Racism brought forward was that coming together of Black and white musicians on the same bill. We now take it for granted, but we have to go back to that period. And it sounds odd, it sounds surreal, but that's where it actually came together. And lastly, I'd say that if we jump forward to where we are now, the parallel is youth. It was the youth that came out on the streets and said, not in our name. It was a youth that marched to Victoria Park in unprecedented numbers, which was a shock to everyone, including the organisers of the concert, that there was this spirit of unity. That says something, and for me, that is hopeful.
Looking back at that time and then looking at the decades that followed and seeing that there are real distinct parallels between what was happening in the 70s and what is happening now. Are you hopeful about the future? Do you despair? I just wondered how you feel about things now and those parallels.
Okay, yeah, there are parallels. I live in the West End, and we during the lockdown, we've been going for long walks, and coincidentally on two running Sundays. First one was Black Lives Matter March, and we just came across it by accident, and I thought, I've seen this somewhere before. And then the following week, it was the Football Hooligans March, whatever you call them. And we came across them purely by accident. And then I suddenly thought, well, I've seen this somewhere before. So I am hopeful partly, but it's diminished a bit in the past 3 months. Great, all these marches of Black Lives Matter. And a lot of the people, 90% of them are young people, and they feel very strongly about it. We shouldn't let that emotion peter out into nothing. It should carry on somehow. And, people like me are a bit beyond it, and it is really up to the younger people. And we've just got to keep up the fight together, basically. And I think it's a community thing. It's us against them.
It's really interesting that the kind of the cyclical nature of the issues that come up in the film and things that we see today. What are the ideas that you would share with young people who are maybe seeing this film and coming to the realization that they're kind of stuck in the matrix? How do we break this cycle where we react to kind of shocking racism and we fight it for a while and it kind of goes away, but then it kind of starts to kind of creep back?
I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about actually is, and when I was making this film, so, it's 40 years ago, isn't it? So 40 years before that was World War II, 40 years since Ra is today. And I think that, I'm hopeful because although we only move on a little bit, we move forwards a little bit within these cycles. But I think that bit that we move on, like now, for example, we can talk about, white privilege, we're able to describe it. Whereas I didn't see that in the 70s. I saw a lot of violence and a lot of anger, but I didn't really see that level of kind of debate that we're having now, and maybe that we've been having for the last, 10, 20 years.
If I could just say that the fight is a very different fight. All of the basics are the same. When I was young, during the late 70s and early 80s, the way you fought back was you bought time out. You opened up the agitprop section. You looked up to see where the National Front were marching, where the anti-National Front people were going to be, and you went there. It was as simple as that. It was confrontation. You could see the enemy. These days, perhaps you can't see the enemy so much. So the fight is through social media. The basics are still there. It's about racism. The fact is, the fight is different, but the basics are the same.
It's got more nuance. I think what technology has done is it's created, between black and white, it's created more grey, which means you need to understand what you're up against. And I think one of the interesting things about where we are now is if you're a young person, this never happened. It's a first for them. It's the first in their lifetime. And so the opportunity here is to connect the past with the present. It's not necessarily about 40 years. This has been happening for centuries, and it's about power. And it's looking at how this power is being challenged. And I think what Ra has done is created a marker in time that we can go back to and say, at this point, 4 decades ago, here is how we challenged this entity, this thing we call racism. And the fact that it involves young people again means there is hope, I think, because we're changing more minds at this point. The big challenge is, how long does this moment last? And what are the actions that come out of this moment? Will we simply reset and go back to where we were? I hope not. I hope that the young people look at that stance that was taken back in the 70s and are empowered.
It would be great to see what the 2020 version of Rock Against Racism would look like today. And I think that's a really kind of a hopeful point at which to kind of bring this kind of discussion to a close. It's an incredible film. I really hope as many people get to see it in the festival as possible. So thank you guys for letting it be part of S.O.U.L Fest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for checking out this S.O.U.L Fest 2020 Q&A with the creators of White Riot. You can check out the film screening right now on the BFI player.